According to McKinsey Company, companies are 33% more profitable when teams are more diverse. 44% of surveyed HR leaders said that employee engagement was their top priority as per a 2018 Cascade HR survey. And 73% of candidates are passive job seekers, according to a TalentNow survey. And while all those are fascinating stats, do you know what to do with that information? How does knowing that information help your organization evolve? The answer is it doesn't, because you need actionable insights from your organization to see how your company stack ranks against others in the marketplace. Stats by themselves mean nothing without context. It's important for companies to understand how they compare with their peers in specific markets. This gives context to the stats and makes them much more meaningful. So my questions are, is there a way to benchmark employee flight risk, for example, or evaluate how your workforce reacts to a company announcement, or even how do you know your HR programs are working? I'm going to be discussing all that and more on the show today, and we're going to be starting right now. My guest today is visionary technology executive with a passion for reducing friction in the employment lifecycle and helping organizations attract more diverse talent faster, improve employee engagement, and reduce voluntary attrition. He's the CEO of Claro Workforce Analytics, and they help companies leverage talent as a competitive advantage by combining internal and external data for benchmarking and competitive analyses to make you a much more strategic organization and be more informed. It's all about data-driven decision-making. Please welcome my guest, Michael Beygelman. Michael, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, so we're gonna. I always say this right in the beginning. We're gonna jump right into the deep end, start some heavy hitting questions. Right? There's obviously most organizations have access to gobs and gobs of information or data that they're collecting within their organization, whether it's talent acquisition, HRIS data, or assessment surveys and things like that. What the hell do they do with all this data? How do they access and make it actionable?
That's really funny.
It wasn't meant to be. It's meant to be a serious question.
Maybe funny was a bad choice of words. Maybe interesting was a better word.
Yeah.
You're right. Organizations have data. The funny thing is there's something called the Johari window, and there's an aspect in the Johari window that says they don't know what they don't know.
Right.
And often after they start in this I don't know what I don't know box, so they start collecting data, then move into what they call the I know what I don't know box.
Right.
It's like really, really interesting. But you're right. There's internal HRIS data. Today, a lot of HR analytics really starts there because you have historical data, whether it's from performance reviews or payroll data or people leaving. You have data around how many people are being hired, et cetera. And from sort of my perspective, that's kind of what I call HR Analytics 101. It's like maybe a hair above what I call reporting. Because ultimately, you need to know like how many people do you have in the pipeline and how many people are up for promotion and things of that nature. But it's interesting, and David Green did a lot of interesting work on this. This is kind of the basic stuff that tells you what is happening in your business.
Okay. So how do you make that actionable though, right? So we talk about data-driven decision-making, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, you're making decisions based on data, but how is it actionable, right?
And this is really interesting. There's a little bit of what I call the emperor has no clothes going on here. There's kind of what we say and what we do. That data in itself is actually not really actionable because it's just a hair above reporting. It just tells you what is happening. In order to make it actionable, you have to add some business logic. Like, for example, if diversity is one of your core values, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And you do a report that shows you that 17% of your organization is diverse, that then creates action. Does that make sense? So the analytics in themselves aren't really actionable, those kinds of analytics, correct?
Okay.
There's business rules, business logic, vision, mission, all those things that then make those analytics somewhat actionable. But to some extent, existing HR analytics that come out of an HRIS system are informational. right? They're not actionable per se. And this is kind of like a complaint that you hear at conferences often, and whispers around dining room tables, etc. When you have HR people talking. I think like the next level beyond that sort of becomes actionable. You have like analytics, and then you have like actionable insights. Like, and like, so let me give you sort
Okay,
of
so really what you're doing, you're pulling back the curtain
yeah.
to show really what's going on behind the scenes that may not be necessarily prevalent or obvious to the average layperson inside of HR. They can't go around surveying every individual, but through some of these HR analytics, you can give them some actionable insights, and then they align that with various campaigns they might have going on, or communications that they're going out, or potentially even a program that's rolling out, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you often see the natural progression of these things aligned to, like, I would call like employee engagement in air quotes.
Okay.
Air quotes, if that's okay.
Right.
It's something that's thrown around all the time. But you could see, are people participating in programs, for example? And this is HR data, correct? You could see, are people taking online learning? Are they taking all the company required things? Are they going to events? This is data that may say, hey, our participation rate is low. But you notice how all this, what I call internal HR data, is information.
Right.
You need to have like business rules or logic to kind of animate that information and make it actionable or relevant.
So is there a way to, let's say that we just rolled out a learning management system inside the organization, and we know that we have low adoption, low utilization. Let's say it's at the 5 to 10% level, which some companies 10% is really high, but let's leave that aside, right? But let's say you're at a 5 to 10% level and you want to get it up to a 15 or 20% level. Or how do you know how to benchmark that? Like, how do I know what my competitors, I mean, I know my competitor surely has an LMS and they're training their employees that way, but what kind of utilization and adoption are they having there? Is there any way to, use that as a benchmark or some kind of competitive data analysis?
That's the panacea, Jeff, right? I
Right.
actually did a presentation of this in London in April about like how to leverage analytics, to kind of help drive your business. And one of the things that kind of got the room laughing is that, we all agree, but unfortunately, like, there is no database that everybody's going to put their information in for the world to see, right?
Right.
Companies aren't readily sharing their information for a myriad of reasons. So it's like, dag nabbit, how do we do it, right?
Right.
So this is kind of why, this is kind of my opinion, that we cannot take like traditional ways of doing things and make them better. You have to kind of reinvent how we do things, right? Because even if you think about like, analogous, look at the iPhone, right? The first iteration was the iPhone was disruptive. You had a phone with no buttons, like literally a phone with no buttons. Like, who does that?
Right.
And now it's iterative, meaning like
Right.
there's still no buttons, but the glass is better, the colors are brighter. Does that make sense? It's no longer like disruptive kind of innovation. So I think when it comes to like HR analytics, the reporting will get better as it does. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The data will get richer as it does, but you're essentially making iPhone 8, iPhone 10, iPhone 11, right? You're not like paradigmically shifting how you actually use this data. And this kind of comes to a little bit of like my personal philosophy, and it's, borderline religion, so I'll caveat it as that. But I believe that a company only can go so far leveraging internal data for decision making.
Right.
It's absolutely necessary, for sure, right? For a myriad of reasons, even basic stuff like compliance reporting. But ultimately, the ability to make decisions is not going to come from within the data you already have, because you're limited by what's inside of your firewall. So you need to be able to really look at external market data. That's the real opportunity. But this creates a challenge, and maybe we could talk about this a little bit, that like, you could look at HR data, and the analogy you could make is to say, I need to find a needle in a haystack. And then you have really cool tools and technologies to help you do that.
Right.
When you look at data outside of your company, the external market data, you're now saying, I want to find a unique piece of hay. That's orders of magnitude more complex.
Right.
right? So we can't like leverage the same types of tools or technologies to do that. So I kind of have this belief that like status quo, like 101 reporting, you need to have really good internal HR metrics, but you need to essentially be able to access external market data to do the very things you talk about. Like for example, you know, our retention rate is 8%. How do I know that's good?
Right.
Like that could
There's
be
got to be some
awful.
kind of benchmark, right? That, you know, how do I know that 8% retention rate, or let's say a 20% attrition rate is good every year, right? Or let's say I've got X number of baby boomers that are going to be retiring in the next couple of years. Is that good for my organization so I can get new blood and new innovation and new ideas coming in, or is that bad for my organization? You know, how does that?
So yeah, so it's really interesting. So we have technology that essentially can measure what's called job seeking activity. The analogy I'm going to give you to how it works, and I'm going to kind of segue into this question to kind of answer your question and maybe create another question. Does that make sense? So it works very similar like a Google alert, right? You know, like when
Okay.
you go on Google, you could create an alert for
Yeah.
like John Doe, and then anytime like a website mentions John Doe, it notifies you. So Google said, hey, people are curious. They want to know when things are happening, right? The problem is this type of a technology doesn't really exist for the workforce space. So we built it, right? The reason why I'm bringing this up is that, you know, when you measure this at scale, imagine measuring the job seeking activity patterns of a company, not just like 5 people, like Walmart. You
Yeah.
begin to see what percentage of Walmart,
Hundreds of thousands of employees and
exactly, you begin to see
millions and
what
millions of
percentage of
transactions every
Walmart
month,
employees
right?
are looking for work, right?
Right.
So then you could essentially say, okay, I'm Walmart, and now we have Target, we have other retailers, right, Pennies, etc. And you could create these sort of macro pools, if you would, of employees, and then you could say, what percentage of my people are looking for work versus my competitors?
Okay.
See, then it becomes kind of like actionable because you could say, okay, if I'm tracking my 5 competitors and 6% of my people are looking for work, but the next person or the next company, like 18% of them are looking for work, well, I'm doing pretty good. But if
Right.
I know that like 15% of my workforce is looking for work, but my next competitor, 6% of them are looking for work, then I know there's something going on internally. Why are my people looking for work? And I'll make one more point and I'll turn it over to you. What's interesting is the level of job seeking activity based on our historical data. We've been doing it for like 5 years, right? So we have like petabytes of data. Um, it doesn't necessarily follow what I call intuitive guidelines, meaning like there are actually industry segments where higher levels of job seeking activity actually correlates to better financial performance. You would
Hmm.
think, anecdotally that less people looking for work equals better financial performance, which is absolutely true for certain industry segments. But for example, in oil and gas, and this is 5 years with the data, there's a pretty strong correlation, like 0.87, right? So it's not like 1, but it's not like zero point 0.3, right? But
Right.
there's a pretty strong correlation between the percentage of people looking for work and their financial results. And
Hmm.
I don't know if like retail or oil and gas actually thrives on turnover. Maybe they need new blood every 9 to 12 months, right? It may be something that's very idiosyncratic to their business versus if you look like at a technology company, very strong correlation for retention versus financial performance, right? You don't want your Java and Hadoop developers walking out the door with the IP. So it's
So
like very
let's go back to the oil and gas, and
yeah,
not to belabor this point, but you know, there's different segments even within oil and gas, right? There's
sure,
people that focus on extraction, refinement,
yeah.
storage, and all that stuff, right? Um, Locating it, the geographic mapping of it underneath the ground. Then you've got offshore and then onshore. You've got
People that
fracking
work
and
on
non.
rigs, yeah, it's all that
Yeah.
stuff.
So can you break down like by segment or like just by industry?
We can because we kind of built like Google for recruiting.
Mhm.
Shameless plug, but we just kind of happened to be on this topic. But we kind of built Google for recruiting. We sort of built a globally scalable search engine that allows you to find this information. Yeah, and it's super interesting.
Okay.
Um, It's like super, super interesting to be honest, you could literally lose hours. Sometimes when I'm looking for information, I blink and 3 hours goes by because I get enamored by our own data. It's like sometimes almost unhealthy because you could literally just lose hours doing a lot of what if scenarios.
Yeah,
But the
my
reason
kids
why,
do that on YouTube with
yeah,
Minecraft.
exactly. Well, the reason why I went down this path, not to digress, is we were earlier talking about, you know, how far you could go with internal data versus external data, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the reasons why the internal data is interesting but not necessarily actionable because it's a very introspective view. It only tells you about what you're doing. And everybody knows that introspection is like the kiss of death, right? Once
Right.
you become very inwardly focused, you forget about, what's happening in your surroundings. So I kind of have this belief that in order to like make the iPhone, like how do we make phone with no buttons, right? You really have to start using external market data. So then you add some intelligence to the information.
So I read one of your blog posts, and I'm going to have to reference my notes here. So um, the question on your blog post was, what is a person who is 83.7% likely to leave, right? And
Yeah.
you go on to say that changing jobs is binary. You either stay at a company or you leave. And that kind of stuck with me for like 2-3 weeks. And I said, you know what? It's not actually whether they stay or whether they go. Should I stay or should I go, right? But what if they stay and they're just underperforming? They're not engaged. Is there a way to measure that?
Yeah, for sure. That's actually a great point. I, you know, my own view on retention is like, this may be unpopular. It doesn't make it not true. But like, not everybody should be retained,
Yeah, of course
right?
not.
Like, retention at the sake of retention is bad, but you'd be surprised at how many organizations are, really focused on retention without asking, like, who should we actually retain?
Well, and I found it interesting from a cultural perspective. I worked at many companies, large corporations, where they would keep absolutely toxic individuals because, let's say they were in sales and they were exceeding their quota by 300-400%, right? But they would absolutely destroy their internal culture, destroy a team, let a hiring manager completely, destroy the morale of an entire segment of the organization just for profitability's sake. And everybody knew that these people were toxic, several complaints about them and actions against them and things like that. But leadership just would not get rid of them. Where did it, actionable insights are one thing, but if they don't take action, what do you do about it?
This is a really good point. I'm often at the epicenter of some of these conversations, believe it or not. I was sort of surprised, would be a good word to use, by how little, I don't want to use the term sophistication, but like, how few processes there actually were internally to figure out who needs to be retained and not. And most importantly, what do you say? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's really interesting. There's these epiphanies where, and again, maybe not politically correct, but people often hide behind the veil of I don't have the data. And if I just had the data, my life would be fine, right?
Right.
Then you show them the data, they quickly say, well, what do I do with it? So it's
Right.
really not about the data because, like, if you could imagine it, somebody's going to invent it. So let's assume it's going to be invented. Now, what do you do? And I find many companies are woefully unprepared and they don't really understand their culture. Or to be fair, the legalities and the compliance of it. Like, can you go sit down and talk to John Doe or Mary Smith? Like, is that a thing you can do? And if you do, what do you say? Because you kind of borderline to say, like, you're essentially judging their employment on their behavior, correct? And if
Right.
they're not violating any laws, then who's to say that their behavior is toxic?
Right.
And is that a reason for promotion or non-promotion if their performance is a 4 or 5, right? This is like a problem that, frankly, I personally don't know how to address. I wish I got a PhD in like organizational psychology or something like that, and I could provide you some input. The best thing that I found that companies do is they create what I call guiding principles. They don't create rules or policies or procedures. Guiding principles guide your actions, right? And you could say, is this person's behavior in alignment with our guiding principles? And if one of your guiding principles is to be kind and they're not kind, then they're not aligned, right? It doesn't then go to say that's good or bad behavior, right?
Right.
That goes to say that that behavior is not aligned with our company culture. And a company has the legal right to maintain whatever culture they want. They
Yeah,
can maintain a
absolutely.
culture,
Well,
drive to
within
work.
legal limits, but yes.
What are you
Yeah.
saying? Culturally, as long as they're not violating the law, they could say, hey, we have a culture of driving to work. You got to drive to work, right?
Right.
They could have a culture of like, hey, everybody telecommutes. No one comes into the office. So like they could choose blue uniforms over brown, right? They have
Right.
like that right without violating the law. So I personally think companies today, when I say companies, I'm generalizing and it's very bad.
Yeah.
But if you look at the fat part of the curve, they don't really operate from a position of guiding principles. So then when they get the data, it's actually difficult for them to make decisions because they try to follow rules and rules and policies say you can't do anything with the data.
Right.
It becomes a circular reference. So I think that companies really need to approach this two ways. One is to hire, if they don't have this skill internally, Jeff, right? To hire some organizational psychologists that could help them understand like how do I instill the culture that helps me grow as a company.
Mm-hmm.
That's really, really important. And then how do I create programs that allow people to feel part of that or to vote themselves off the island, as I say.
Right.
Because what I found was when you begin to focus on guiding principles and culture, the toxic people just leave. It's like really, really interesting. Again, I hate to generalize.
Yeah, I think that would be a gross generalization, but
Yeah.
I'd like to see some data around that.
No, like I said, it's
I mean,
just like it's a generalization that
yeah,
I personally observed, but I have no
yeah,
scientific proof that it exists. I do
exactly.
know that like culture trumps a lot.
Yes.
And so it's like I think
If you
like
like your boss, you like who your
yeah.
team you're working with, and you feel like you're being valued and you're having an impact, absolutely.
And
I
then
would.
so like for example, this is then how data aligns to that, right? So let's say one of your culture, like one of your core principles or guiding values is around diversity, correct?
Mhm.
And let's say we were talking about before, let's say you're measuring job seeking activity, right? And then you could see at the organizational level that on average, 8 to 10% of the workforce for any hiring manager are looking for work. But there's this one manager where 35% of their people are looking for work. If you have this culture and then you double click and you see that most of the people that work for that manager are in the diverse or the protected classes. All right. So then it gives you reason to say, hey, we want to double click in that area and see if they're aligned with our guiding principles.
Right.
And then it becomes easier to have the conversation because it's no longer about discrimination or all those things you don't want to accuse people falsely of, correct? You then
Yeah,
have a
absolutely.
different.
So let me go back to this diversity thing. So I've been having this conversation with several people in the industry that are diversity experts, diversity, inclusion, and military experts, and these are nationally known or globally known speakers that go around and they talk about diversity inclusion. One of them in particular is advocating redacting certain types of information that are found on a resume, like city and state, like phone numbers, zip or area codes, like first and last names, like if they went to a specific university or belong to a specific sorority, things like that, right? That might give an inclination to the recruiter or to the hiring manager as to what their ethnicity, their race, their background, their religion, all those things, right? So what's your position on redaction in resumes?
How should I say? So what? Like I'm 50. Just for context,
Yeah.
I've had lots of jobs in my life. I've started some companies. I've built some companies. I took a company public. I know a lot of executives. I've yet to have a conversation where somebody actually said that they were really like discriminating. I think it's one of these things like if they do that, great. Why not? Right? Is it actually a problem? I don't know. I talk to a lot of people. Like I don't see droves of people being discriminated on because they live in a specific town. I just personally don't see it. So I don't know if it's fair for me to comment to it. I've personally never seen it. It may happen.
It
And if it
happens.
does, and
So
if it,
when I was in the RPO world, we had a client who shall remain nameless. 50% of their candidate slate was diversity. The concept was we're going to give them 4 candidates for every open job. We'd
Mhm.
give them 50% diversity slate. 3% of their hires were actually diversity. So there's a huge gap there.
Huge,
So
yeah,
they said, look, can you increase maybe it's the quality of candidates from the diversity pool or something like that. Can you increase the number of diversity candidates to 75%? So we
sure.
went from 2 candidates to 3 candidates out of every slate on a 4 slate candidate or 4 candidate slate. And the number of candidates that they hired that were diversity actually dropped from 3% down to
It's
2.8%.
not funny, but I understand what you mean.
Yeah, and it wasn't just a 1 month tracking. This was over a 6 month period, several hundred hires, so it was absolutely statistically relevant. They had a absolute bias towards minority and diversity candidates in that organization, specifically with 3 hiring managers, and it was on the manufacturing floor in this one facility. So it absolutely exists. Additionally, the retention levels for those diversity candidates were at 200 to 300% lower than the average, white male, let's say,
Yeah.
the average other employee.
And
So it
as I
exists.
it's probably you know more about it than me. I've been in a professional space. I don't really see that much of it. My position, as I stated, if there's technology that could do that, sure, great.
Yeah.
I think, and if it actually moves the needle, I think that would be great. My fear as a technology executive is I see the downside of it. And I think that may be like a whole other segment, because if we're talking about, recruitment process automation and all these wonderful things, all you're doing is you're teaching the computer how to be biased against non-diversity people.
Right.
So like the problem is in as much bias as there is against diversity people, when you teach people not to look at non-diversity people, you're telling them to bias non-diversity people. So it's a slippery slope, but I think it really goes back to company culture. Like in the example you stated, that was actually brilliant, because they were able to narrow it down to, we don't have a company diversity problem, we have a 3 or 4 hiring manager diversity problem.
Well, it was systemic throughout several different locations, but this was the one location where we actually had the data to go back to the executive leadership and
Yeah,
say, look, we can increase your candidate slate to 100%, but your hiring is going to be dropped off,
same thing. Yeah,
significantly.
yeah.
So
I'm not
what you need
surprised.
to do is get in a diversity culture training expert and, go that route instead. And
Yeah,
that's,
especially if diversity was one of their core values, because clearly the manager wasn't acting in alignment with their sort of core values.
I mean, they were looking at, and the reason I brought this thing about redaction was they were like, well, maybe your recruiters are being biased against diversity candidates. Why don't we, look at some redaction technologies and things like that? We said, look, all you're doing is kicking that can a little bit further down the road.
Sure.
And now, wherever that stopping point is, wherever the bottleneck is, that's where it's going to land. And ultimately, whether I pass them 2 candidates, 1 candidate, or 3 candidates on a 4 candidate slate, it's up to the hiring manager to interview those candidates, right? So all you're doing is, at some point in time, they're going to show up for work. At some point in time, they're going to do a face-to-face interview, most likely, or a Skype interview, or
Yeah.
whatever. It's going to get divulged, right? So I would rather track the data on, what that hiring manager or that department's background is for hiring diversity candidates. And if
Yeah.
that's where you have the problem, start addressing it through training and other methods rather
And it's
than
great
through
because a lot of
redaction.
the information can come from like an ATS or something, right? Because you
Yeah.
see the applicant pool. And there are lots of really cool analytics reporting tools that can allow you to like see that in real time. Some are built in, like people use like Workday, they have like their own stuff that's built in. But there are other tools. There's companies like Domo that do dashboarding. There's companies like Vizier and Tableau and stuff. Generally speaking, even a lot of the CRMs and the ATSs have reporting around that kind of stuff, like
Yeah.
at least the better ones. They may not be like fascinating world class, but they give you real-time information about like what your funnel looks like, who's being rejected, what the status is of those people, et cetera. So I think like frontline HR leadership can get access to that info pretty quickly.
All right. So what action is actually missing, and what one thing can companies do to hire and be more diverse?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I think
That's why I asked it, Mike.
of course, instantly sweat. um, my personal opinion on this is that it really starts with culture. This is what
Yeah.
I was talking about before. And culture is something that's interesting that I really like because it's also your only true competitive advantage. Because as soon as you document the process, it's no longer a competitive advantage because it's replicable. So anything that's replicable is really not your competitive advantage. And so, but what's not replicable is culture, right? How you behave, what your philosophy is, what your vision is, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the real answer to diversity really starts at the top. I mean, this is kind of interesting because company leadership and boards have to say, like, who do we want to be? Like, what is our ethos, right?
Right.
Do we want to be charitable? Do we want to be, socially responsible? Do we want to be diverse? And companies ultimately make decisions, and they're business decisions. The unsexy truth is that sometimes do good decisions are actually business decisions, correct?
Yeah.
Like,
Hold them to Wall Street. So
yeah, exactly. If you look at retail banking is a perfect example, correct? They want to attract more clients. So you have a more diverse population of people working in banks to attract those diverse clients. Now, granted, I don't know what's driving that decision for diversity, and I don't want to judge it, but it is a fact that it does help their earnings, right?
okay. Yeah.
So the truth of the matter is, I don't know what happens in boardrooms to say, are they focusing on culture as a means to an end, right? They know if they have a better culture that they're going to, have better results. Or are they focusing on culture because it's actually important to them? But I think that that's the one thing you do to drive diversity, whether it's military, veteran, et cetera, et cetera. Those are things that have to be near and dear. Like, for example, when I worked at Adecco, we had a partnership with the Olympics, and we helped to redeploy athletes. And that's very difficult because if you take an Olympic athlete that's been an Olympic athlete since they were 6 years old,
Yeah.
is the only thing they know how to do. What if they have an injury at the age of 20? Like, it's very difficult for them to get inserted into the workforce, yet they have so much value to bring. So we had a really cool partnership. Was it a windfall for us? Absolutely not. It was a huge money pit, right? But it was absolutely the right thing to do. And I'm not giving a plug to Adecco, but it was absolutely the right thing to do.
Right.
And we did it, and we helped that because it was part of our values, right? And that then attracted. It had like downstream implications, right? It helped to attract like-minded clients that wanted to do business with us that had the same core values. So even though we did it because we thought that it was the right thing to do, ultimately it kind of helped our business. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I'm going to pivot just a little bit to you and I we were both at HR Tech, not this year, but last year. I'm sure you were at HR Tech this year, but in 2018, and we were walking around together or at the booth, and we both noticed how many booths had AI or machine learning kind of slapped across their booth somewhere, right? I know that AI is absolutely prevalent, right? But what do you see in the industry as far as, there seems to be this faux layer of AI, and then there's an actual AI taking place, right?
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about what you're seeing
So
as far as how AI is being.
I'm going to do a quid pro quo, Jeff. What
Yeah.
does the term A and what does the term I mean before I answer the question?
Go ahead.
So people use AI and they're not really lying, but they're not telling you that they're not thinking artificial intelligence.
Okay.
They're thinking augmented intelligence,
All right.
which are two radically different things. We build technology. I can tell you there's no AI in recruiting. It's all a sham. But it sells and people buy it. And what happened is HR recruiting leaders now put the label of AI on something that they don't want to take the time to understand. So if I don't want to take the time, oh, it's AI. It's just easy, right? But there's actually no AI. There are programmatic rules. What are chatbots? Programmatic rules. Jimmy says this, you say that. Jimmy says this, you say that. Mary says this, you do that. This person clicks this. These are just programmed. There's no intelligence whatsoever. The fact of the matter is, when you deploy the systems, you actually have to teach them. And what they don't tell you is it takes months and months and months and months for them to actually be productive. Or they have to read all your recruiters' emails. So how about that?
Right.
And it's so it's like, ooh, sure, let me turn over 6 months worth of company emails for some chatbot to see how we handle declination. It's kind of like, but it's easy to sell and it's easy to buy. So if we agree that today there is augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence, then we could have a cool conversation.
So how do you make that leap from augmented to artificial? Is that
Uh,
just through cognitive? Is that through machine learning, getting feedback loops in place? What
well,
what,
there's
how are
ML and
you?
feedback loops today. That's what ML is. There's essentially feedback loops, and you train
Right.
the machine, right? That's what I mean. That's what augmented intelligence is. That's
Okay.
programmatic rules that are augmented by things that happen. So you have a feedback loop that teaches you, but that's not AI.
Okay.
AI is radically, radically different. And that's really, really important. So anyway, I think like society is actually not ready for AI in HR and recruiting. I'm just going to be honest.
Well,
Because
let me ask you. Whether you call it augmented or artificial intelligence is, let's just say that's slicing bread a different way, right? It's still bread, right? But, is let's say a search, match, and stack ranking algorithm that's built on a augmented
yep.
reality or is that more efficient, or does that have the potential to be more efficient than a source or a recruiter?
Oh, 100%, because a
Okay.
computer follows the rules programmatically very, very quickly. We
Right.
joke because we use ML in our product, right? And we
Right.
just say, like, we could take that and make it 1,000 times faster. And if you have a bad rule, now you just make that bad decision 1,000 times faster.
Right.
It's just, and it learns how to make those bad decisions. Look at Amazon, right? They shut down after their 2 years,
Right.
their quote unquote AI hiring, because it was actually reinforcing bias. Of course,
Yeah.
it'll reinforce bias because it's going to want to hire the best candidates, which may not be diverse.
Right.
So
Well,
this
they
is
built it on whatever their existing employee pool was, and
the,
they modeled it after that. So therefore,
an ongoing
if you
hiring,
have,
not just their
yeah,
existing employee pool.
right. So if you have a whole bunch of white males in leadership positions and they're the high performers because that's what you have in the organization, then that you've trained your AI on it, then of course that's what it's going to bring into your
Right.
organization
And
after
and
that.
this is the thing. So what happens is, if one of your core values is diversity, but you have an augmented intelligence machine, if you would, that selects based on what's good for your company may not necessarily be your core value of diversity. This is
Right.
why I say society in terms of HR and recruiting is actually not really ready for AI. I'll tell you why. Who do you blame? Like today, it's very easy. No,
Yeah,
I'm being
you blame
honest.
the recruiter, blame the hiring manager. You
But you
can't blame
don't.
the
Can't
yeah.
blame the AI. No, I'm being very serious. Who do you fire? Who
Yeah.
do you discipline?
I made this point. I was having a conversation with Aaron Stewart from job.com,
Yep.
and the premise was that, hey, if AI is doing the job that most recruiters would be doing for searching, matching, and stack ranking the candidate, who gets the credit and who gets the blame when it goes
Exactly.
right for making the hire? I mean, who is the subject matter expert at that point? Is it the AI, augmented or artificial intelligence, or is it the actual recruiter?
Or is it the software developer that built the algorithm?
Exactly.
Or
Exactly.
the psychologist that built the model, right? So
Or
you
was it the data that they happened to be able to build the
right?
modeling
And,
on?
and this becomes a circular reference where at the end, and I'm a technologist, I could say, thank God we don't actually have AI in recruiting today. We'd all be in trouble. Uh, but I think that there's a progression towards that. But we also, as a society, need to be ready for the consequences of real AI. And I don't think we are. If you look at something very basic like autonomous vehicles, right? How many tens of thousands of people are killed each year? But it only took one in Phoenix to be killed by an autonomous car to literally shut down the whole program. Because
Right.
who do you blame? The car, the manufacturer, the programmer? Who goes to jail? Who gets the manslaughter charge? Do you understand?
Right.
It becomes a really, really slippery slope. So society in general is not ready for artificial intelligence in HR and recruiting. Augmented intelligence and ML is pretty cool, and we still need to sort that out, right? So Anyway, this is my personal opinion. I know I probably am going to get a lot of shade for that
That's
opinion,
fine.
but
I'm still going to call it artificial intelligence because, that's the nomenclature people are using today, whether it's, technologically correct or not, it is what it is, right? So,
yeah.
all right, we are just about out of time. Any last thoughts on our, how to gain as much insights out of your organization and fun stuff like that?
Oh, no, this is great. I love the fact that we digressed into very interesting topics.
Yeah, we just went off track.
Yeah, it's okay. They're actually very interesting topics. They're things I think about all the time, but having the ability to kind of kick those around with you is like really, really awesome, one-on-one.
Awesome.
And I think like that, generally speaking, there's this ongoing datafication of HR. This is my kind of parting words, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if datafication is a real word or I made it up like some time ago,
You
but
made it up.
so I probably made it up. They call those things Beygelmanisms, by the way. So if you ever hear this made up word, it's called the Beygelmanism, where I just kind of make up a word on the fly. But there's this datafication of HR where if you look at leadership, they're no longer people that are coming from payroll and benefits. They're people coming from like Wharton and Harvard, right? They're business people that are looking at HR as a business. And those kinds of people are wired a little differently. They will require data to make better business decisions. And it can't be fluff. So I think that as we kind of go through this datafication of HR, there is this challenge that I see to provide relevant, actionable, meaningful data that's not just like number crunching what you have and making prettier charts, but it's actually providing advanced analytics to help company make better business decisions like around workforce planning, things of that nature. So I think that we're just very, very early in this trend of datafication. And I think that we'll see more and more and more organizations basically move towards a data-driven HR model. That's kind of how I see it. That's kind of my last point.
I hope they do. I think there's a lot of information being locked away in these systems, whether it's an HRIS or an ATS. And I know at the RPO we didn't use any of the data. It just sat
nice
there.
Eye candy, right?
Yeah. I mean, I knew how many candidates I had hundreds of thousands of resumes and profiles and all that stuff. And that's what I really looked at. But having that deep understanding of, hey, I'm seeing a trend here, I'm seeing an insight there, had no insight into any of that stuff. So
Brilliant.
Fascinating conversation, Michael. Stick around for the after hour show. Do you guys have a blog or anything? Because I could geek out on this all day long, right? Do you guys do any writing or anything?
Oh, we do like micro posts. Thank you for asking. Okay. If you go to like LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook, just look for Claro, CLARO, Workforce Analytics.
Okay.
Our social media manager posts something just about every day, and we post like cool things. We do things like, hey, where are companies doing their grad hiring from? Or what does the diversity population look like for Java developers in San Francisco or something like that. So we post some really cool tidbits of information every day. We typically post the same thing to all the channels. So if you follow us on one or more channels, you'll get these snippets. There's also really cool, what I call copy pastable infographics. So if you need something for your next presentation, usually along with the post, we have like some really good eye candy that you can download.
Good.
Yeah,
so I mean, I was always looking for, if I'm a speaker going up on stage and I need some kind of data to kind of prove the point that I'm making on stage, I loved using.
Yeah, follow us there. There's some really cool information. Thanks for asking.
I'll get a link and I'll put it in the description for everybody. And if you are interested in seeing a demonstration or you just want more information about Claro HR, you can go to their site and click on the demo, get a demo link or the contact us. I'll put a link in the description so you can follow us there. Michael, again, thank you again. Stay around because we're going to go into some more difficult questions on the after hour show. All right.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. You're the best, man. Thanks a lot.